What's the dumbest mistake you've seen an incompetent coworker make? Story 1. I worked at a summer camp where most of the employees were college students, but one time we hired this guy in his early 40s. At first it seemed fine. He was just trying a little too hard to act like he was still 20. But things started getting weird pretty quickly. He kept getting in trouble for strange behavior. He was caught at least 3 times working shirtless with the kids. He'd be out canoeing and suddenly rip off his shirt and life jacket, or he'd just lie in the middle of the park with no shirt on. He was trying to relive his glory days, and no one was comfortable with it. Then came our overnight training. It started at 9 a.m. and went all the way until 3 p.m. the next day. As a camp, we set up our tents around the site for the overnight portion. He was his usual self at the beginning, but as the day went on, he started acting stranger. He kept sneaking off to his tent for 10-20-minute intervals. His tent was set up far away from everyone, so it was hard to keep track of him. He kept getting weirder and weirder as the day passed. During one of our training sessions, he took off his shirt while the boss was talking and threw it into the fire while screaming. Then he started talking a lot about his ex-wife, yelling at birds and just generally saying strange things. Things took a turn when he started talking about intimate relations. Around dinner time, he suddenly ran to his car and drove out of the parking lot, tires screeching. We all thought, okay, he's gone. Thank God. Let's get back to the training. But about an hour later, we heard his car screech back into the parking lot, and our manager just started shaking her head, muttering, "Oh God, he's back." And then we saw him. He came running at full speed out of the woods and cannonballed into the lake. He got out, completely bare, and walked over to where we were sitting. He started doing the helicopter, and then somehow put his arms around both of my bosses and declared his love for them. By this point, we could all smell him. He reeked of alcohol like a walking distillery. He then asked us when we were going to take our clothes off and encouraged us to get this party started. At this point, he was escorted out, and someone went to clean up his tent. They found he had been smoking out of pop cans and had a stash of liquor bottles hidden around. He was scheduled for a shift the next Monday at 11, and he texted us saying he'd be late because he had a meeting with the boss. Needless to say, he never showed up for that shift. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. Back in college, I took a summer job at a golf course. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough and gave me a tan. The job had a bit of everything: mowing, trimming, weed whacking, and the occasional run-in with the local wildlife. One day, our supervisor instructed a few of us to clean up a patch along the riverbank. Now, anyone who's worked outdoors in our area knows the golden rule. If you see poison ivy, stop. Either you avoid the area entirely, or you gear up with full protective suits and respirators. No one takes chances with that stuff. The oils from poison ivy can get aerosolized when disturbed, especially with power tools like weed whackers. If you breathe it in, it's more than just a rash. It can be deadly. So, imagine my horror when I arrived on site to see 2 of my coworkers already hard at work, weed whacking like madmen. The air around them was thick with shredded leaves and stems, and it wasn't just any brush. It was poison ivy, the thickest I had ever seen. Neither of them was wearing protective suits, gloves, or even safety glasses. Just shorts, t-shirts, and a blind trust in their invincibility. I sprinted off the cart and practically screamed at them. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? That's poison ivy. You're aerosolizing it. It's everywhere." They stopped, dumbfounded, looking around like they were seeing the plants for the first time. By the end of the day, they were in the hospital. Both of them had to be put on high-dose steroids to manage the allergic reaction. The doctors told them they were lucky. Inhaling poison ivy oils can cause serious respiratory failure, and in some cases, even death. It still baffles me how they didn't stop to question what they were weed whacking, or at least ask someone. It's a miracle we didn't have 2 funerals that summer. Story 3. I work as a social worker, and one of the most horrifying experiences I've ever had in my career started with a simple phone call from a concerned mother. We're required to visit clients who live with families at least once a year, more frequently if there are any risk factors involved. But in this case, the mother had not seen or heard from her assigned social worker in over 2 years. She had left voicemails, emails, everything short of smoke signals. Nothing came back. Frustrated and worried, she eventually called the emergency on-call worker who was filling in while the regular staff were out. The on-call worker opened up the case file, expecting to see a backlog of unfulfilled duties, only to be stunned by what she found. According to the file, the assigned worker had been logging regular visits. There were notes, details, assessments, all of which looked completely normal. It was so detailed that it seemed impossible it could be faked. But the mother insisted she had never seen this woman in 2 years. This inconsistency led to an internal audit of the worker's entire caseload, and what they found was disturbing. She had logged a visit to a client who had died months prior. To confirm suspicions, her supervisor decided to do a surprise follow-up visit to one of the clients she was scheduled to see that very day. The worker never showed. Yet the next morning she logged the visit as though she had gone, complete with phony notes and interactions. The aftermath of this was far-reaching. I couldn't help but think of the Phoenix Sinclair case from Manitoba, Canada. In that tragic incident, a social worker had also logged fake visits, and Phoenix, a child in that system, had been murdered by her parents. The falsified records covered up months of abuse and neglect. That case caused a massive uproar in Manitoba. The government panicked and began checking the safety of every child in the system. Kids deemed at risk were taken away from their homes and placed in emergency foster care. But because there weren't enough foster parents, many children ended up being warehoused in hotels. It was a policy built on panic, a knee-jerk reaction to systemic failure, and it created an entirely new crisis. It was a humanitarian nightmare. That experience shook me. It reminded me that paperwork, no matter how polished, is not a substitute for presence, and that some people will exploit the trust this system requires in the worst possible way. Story 4. In a previous job, I worked at a small but growing tech company. We had maybe 20 employees in total, so everyone wore multiple hats. We had a chief accounting officer, let's call her Linda, who had been with the company since its earliest days. She was technically our CEO, but more importantly, she was the only person handling our books. I walked into her office one day and noticed her working on a massive Excel spreadsheet. It had thousands of rows, tracking every expense and payment from the past quarter. She would type a number into cell A1, then another into B4. And then, instead of using a formula, she'd pull out a handheld calculator, manually add the numbers, and type the result into C1. No formulas, no automation, just calculator math. I asked her gently if she knew Excel could do the math automatically. Just a simple A1 plus B1 would do the trick. Her eyes widened like it was the first time she'd ever heard that. I sat with her for a bit, showed her how formulas worked, and even helped her copy them across rows. I genuinely thought I had helped her save hours of labor. Fast forward a few months. I passed by her desk again, and there she was again, calculator in hand, entering data manually just like before. She had completely reverted to her old method. It was almost impressive. Thousands of rows, hundreds of hours, all typed in manually, number by number, calculated with a plastic calculator from the 1990s. I think she saw it as her system. Maybe it gave her a sense of control. But for a tech company where efficiency was the name of the game, it was like watching someone churn butter in a factory full of robots. It was the most bizarre display of digital stubbornness I've ever seen. Story 5. Years ago, I worked in a school district with 5 different elementary schools. One of my coworkers, we'll call her Janice, was a guidance counselor assigned to all 5 schools. She was supposed to rotate through them, spending 1 day a week at each location. It wasn't a perfect system, but it worked well enough, assuming, of course, that the counselor did their job. Janice, however, had other priorities. She developed a habit of calling in to say she wouldn't be at her scheduled school for the day because there was an urgent case at one of the other schools. Sometimes she'd even switch it up midweek, saying she had to respond quickly to something important. At first, we took her at her word. These things happen in school counseling: emotional crises, student emergencies, and family interventions. But then one day during lunch, Janice made a critical mistake. She was talking about her favorite soap opera, describing the twists and turns of that day's episode. She mentioned something that had just aired. The only problem was, this was before VCRs and DVRs. The show aired midday, while she was supposed to be on campus counseling kids. One of the school principals was sitting at our lunch table. He stood up slowly, smiled politely, and said, "See me when you're done with your lunch." It didn't take long for the audit to begin. Turns out, Janice hadn't seen more than a handful of students in months. She had been skipping out, faking emergencies, and going home to watch daytime TV. She eventually resigned, likely before they could fire her. To this day, whenever I see someone glued to a soap opera during work hours, I think of Janice. Story 6. I used to be a float pharmacist, which meant I rotated between different locations of a grocery store pharmacy chain. It was a good gig, variety, flexibility, and you got to work with a wide range of people. But at one location, there was this dangerously incompetent pharmacy assistant. She wasn't new, exactly. She had been there for almost 9 months, but no amount of shadowing or training seemed to stick. She couldn't remember basic procedures. Everyone knew she was a liability, but because she was union protected, it was difficult to fire her outright. Our pharmacy system was foolproof. You scan a drug bottle, then the system prints a label if it's the correct medication. If not, it alerts you, and no label prints. Somehow she still managed to screw it up. One day, a prescription came in for 200 tablets of gliclazide, a diabetes medication. Most bottles only contain 100, so she'd have to open two. What I believe happened is this. She scanned the wrong bottle first, glyburide, then realized her mistake and scanned the right one. But when she went to grab a vial, she absent-mindedly opened both bottles and dumped their contents into one container. I always check pills before handing them over. That day they looked fine at first glance. But later, when the patient came to pick up the prescription, the bottle had been jostled. And I always open it one final time at pickup. And that's when I noticed it. Two different pills inside one vial. My stomach dropped. She had mixed glyburide and gliclazide together. Both are sulfonylureas, drugs that stimulate insulin production, but this patient was on a low dose of gliclazide. Glyburide is far stronger. The risk of severe hypoglycemia, especially for an elderly patient like this, was enormous. I apologized to the patient, fixed the order, and then had a very stern conversation with her. From that moment on, she wasn't allowed to put bottles in the recycling. Everything she touched had to remain visible for verification. I couldn't trust her to enter prescriptions or do anything beyond labeling. I told her manager. She got written up. Eventually, she quit. Not because of the write-up, but because everyone was fed up with her. No one trusted her. No one liked working with her. Honestly, it was a relief when she left. She could have killed someone. Story 7. At the paint shop where I used to work, new chemicals were introduced pretty regularly. The policy was clear. Anytime we got a new substance, we were required to review its material safety data sheet. You don't mess around with chemicals in an enclosed space. Too many are corrosive, flammable, or outright lethal. But this one guy, man, he didn't get the memo. I walked into the shop one day and saw him spraying a new compound without any safety gear. No mask, no gloves, just standing there like he was watering his garden. I looked at the label on the bucket and nearly dropped it. Highly corrosive and poisonous. I told him he needed to be suited up. At the very least, wear gloves and a respirator. He brushed me off with a grin and said, "It's baby safe. Look, there's a baby on the label." Yes, the label featured an image of a baby, but it was not playing. It was gasping, choking, surrounded by hazard warnings in multiple languages. The image was meant to be a warning, not an endorsement. "This is the baby," I shouted. "He is not playing, he is not swimming, he is dying." Thankfully, someone else backed me up, and he finally stopped. A picture of a dying baby was used as justification to ignore every safety protocol we had. Story 8. Back when I was in the Navy, we had a first-class petty officer transfer into our unit. He came from another ship and seemed experienced enough, so nobody questioned much at first. That is, until we had a night ops training mission on San Diego Bay. After the training, we returned to base and began checking in all our gear, including night vision goggles, NVGs. Each pair was serialized and accounted for. I was logging them in when I noticed something strange. One of the NVGs was not the standard issue. It was an older model, and the serial number didn't match any of the sets assigned to our command. To make things worse, we were missing one of our pairs. Same checkout group, same timing. The NVG that didn't belong was registered to the ship that the new guy had transferred from. He had stolen it a few years earlier, gotten away with it, and now was trying to swap it out for one of our newer models. We alerted command, and after an investigation, it all came crashing down for him. He was placed on restriction and eventually discharged from the Navy. What blows my mind is how confidently he did it, like nobody would notice serialized military gear getting switched out. He probably got away with it once and thought he could outsmart the system again. But the Navy doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive stolen optics. Story 9. When I served in the Coast Guard, quick response was not just ideal, it was often the difference between life and death. In the icy northern waters we patrolled, the life expectancy of someone who fell overboard without a survival suit could be measured in minutes. One night, a distress report came in. A vessel nearby thought they had seen another boat in trouble. They couldn't make radio contact, but something didn't feel right. The conditions were harsh, visibility was poor, and silence on the VHF radio was alarming. It was the kind of situation we're trained for: act first, confirm later. But our watch commander froze. He kept asking for more details. Are you sure? Did they see anyone in the water? Can they confirm the name of the vessel? Meanwhile, precious minutes ticked by. I kept thinking, you can find out the boat's name later. You can't resuscitate corpses. We don't need perfect clarity when lives might be on the line. Finally, after 3 or 4 agonizing minutes, I said screw it and launched the boat myself. When we arrived, the situation wasn't as dire as it could have been. The boat's radio was broken, and it was riding low in the water, making it look like it was sinking. The occupants were fine. I thought I was going to be court-martialed for disobeying an order. But the commanding officer backed me. He had a long talk with the watch commander afterward and made it clear, you will never get in trouble for responding to a false alarm, but you will be damned if you ignore a real one. The same guy, I later learned, had once dismissed a red flare as a hoax. 2 people died that night. Story 10. I worked at a veterinary hospital for several years, long enough to know that the worst smells are often the ones no one wants to talk about. One day, I returned to the office after a few days off and noticed a stench that could only be described as apocalyptic. Customers were complaining, staff were gagging, and the air fresheners didn't work. No one could figure out where it was coming from. I started hunting for the source. I followed the smell to the supply storage area, stacked with identical cardboard boxes, and after digging for several minutes, I found it. Inside, nestled among paperwork and supplies, was a dead seagull. Turns out, a family had brought it in days earlier after finding it dying on a beach. Their daughter had hoped we could save it, but unfortunately, it had passed before arriving. Our vet tech had taken the bird and was supposed to dispose of it, a simple process of labeling it and placing it in the freezer. Instead, he tossed it in a random box and forgot about it, then went about his shifts like nothing had happened. I walked up to the head receptionist, holding the box at arm's length, and said, "So, seagull?" Her face went red with fury. He didn't last long after that. Story 11. My brother's funeral was supposed to be a solemn, respectful occasion, and it was eventually, but for a few minutes it nearly turned into a comedy of errors. We were part of a long funeral procession. The hearse was leading us to what we assumed was cemetery, a smaller, more private one, where my brother was to be laid to rest next to his son. Instead, we pulled into Cemetery A, the larger one where most of our family had been buried in years past. There was a groundskeeper there standing awkwardly with a puzzled look. He hadn't opened any graves that day, and certainly wasn't expecting a funeral. My heart sank. I knew immediately what had happened. I called the funeral home, who then contacted the hearse driver. As we exited, I rolled down the window and shouted to the confused groundskeeper, "We've changed our minds." My nephew, my brother's son, was livid. He sped up toward the hearse, fists clenched, teeth gritted. For a second I thought he was going to ram it with his car, or drag the driver out for a one-sided boxing match. Luckily, his wife talked him down via phone, and by the time we reached the correct cemetery, emotions had calmed somewhat. He bolted out of the car in grief and frustration, but I intercepted him. "Hey," I barked, planting myself in front of him. "Your dad would be laughing his butt off right now." That stopped him. He blinked, and then the tears came. And just like that, the tension broke. A few minutes later, my aunt, wise, gray-haired, and soft-spoken, walked up to us and dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "That was the sweetest thing I've ever seen," she said. The way they passed his mother's grave like that was so touching. Story 12. We had this employee who was helping prep the ice cream machine. The process was simple. Pour the cream mixture into the reservoir, let it churn and serve. Only this time she grabbed the wrong container. Instead of the cream, which came in clearly labeled cardboard cartons, similar to orange juice containers, she grabbed a massive plastic jug with a screw top and poured sink cleaning solution into the machine. I happened to walk by and caught her mid-pour. "Stop!" I yelled. "What are you doing?" She looked up, nonchalant, and said, "It's fine. It was only a little." A little? It was toxic cleaning chemicals, and she had just mixed them into food-grade machinery. I had to drain the entire machine, clean it inside and out, and toss out a full batch of contaminated ice cream mix. What baffled me most was that the containers didn't even look remotely alike. One was plastic, industrial, and had corrosive written in all caps. The other was soft cardboard, labeled vanilla dairy mix. I still don't know how she made that mistake, or how she survived without a lawsuit. Story 13. We were on a field trip to a farm and pumpkin patch with a group of 4 and 5-year-olds. You can imagine the chaos, kids running around, squealing at goats, feeding chickens, and climbing hay bales. Each of us teachers had our group to supervise, and I was meticulous about it. Head counts every hour. Attendance checks before moving. It's just part of the job. One of my fellow teachers, though, seemed less engaged. Throughout the day, I noticed her trailing behind, letting kids wander a little too far, and spending more time talking to the staff than watching her group. When it was time to leave, I loaded my kids onto one of the 3 buses we'd rented. After my group was secure and double-counted, I noticed the other teacher boarding her bus before her students. I casually walked over and peeked inside. She was sitting down already, waving the kids in without even looking up. I asked her if she'd done a head count. She smiled and said, "We're all good, let's go." I didn't answer. I just started counting. We were missing one. I got off the bus and started scanning the area. There he was, a small boy from her group, still on the playground, mingling with kids from another school. I walked him back to the bus, heart pounding. When we got back, she dared to blame the child, saying he wandered off. "No, ma'am. You wandered off from your responsibilities." I reported the incident to the administration. She was furious, but I'd do it again. We're not just glorified babysitters. These kids and their parents trust us with their lives. Story 14. When I was 5, my school had no playground, so we walked 2 blocks to a public park for recess. I still remember the day I got left behind, not because I did anything wrong, but because my teacher failed to do her job. A friend and I were playing near the edge of the designated boundary, hunting roly-polies near the fence. We were still within the area, still in view of the teacher, but she never blew the whistle, never called us in. And she left, just like that. I took the rest of the class, didn't count heads, didn't look back. Luckily, another class from our school showed up shortly after and spotted us. Their teacher brought us back, safe and sound. But when my parents came to the school, furious, the assistant principal blamed me. She told them I had run off. I hadn't. I was 5 feet away from the class. I just didn't see them leave. My mom nearly climbed over the desk. My dad had to restrain her. Even at 5, I remember thinking, why am I being blamed for this? It was the teacher's job to make sure we were all there. And blaming a 5-year-old to save your skin. That's a new level of cowardice. Story 15. I used to manage a city-run recycling center. One day, a baler, a massive machine used to compress cardboard, had blown a fuse. These weren't your average fuses either. They were huge, high-voltage industrial ones. The kind you do not mess with until power is cut off. We were still trying to figure out where to get a replacement, and hadn't shut off the power yet when he walked in. Every workplace has that one guy who's a walking insurance liability. This was ours. Before we could stop him, he picked up a screwdriver and jammed it into the fuse slot. There was a blinding flash. My vision went white. I thought he was dead. When I could see again, there he was, standing somehow unscathed, blinking like nothing had happened. I fired him on the spot. We called in professionals to fix the baler, and I made it clear no one was to touch anything without supervision again. The man was a miracle, not because he was clever, but because he wasn't dead. Story 16. I used to work at a bowling alley. Most of the time it was a fun gig, cleaning lanes, helping guests, fixing jams. One day, a group of kids, maybe 4 to 8 years old, were bowling on one of the lanes. One of their balls had stopped halfway down the gutter, and someone needed to retrieve it. My coworker volunteered. He walked down the lane, picked up the ball, but instead of walking it back to the kids, he had a different idea. He bowled the ball back toward the group. Yes, he rolled a bowling ball at a crowd of children. Fortunately, one of the parents saw it coming and lunged forward, catching the ball before it hit anyone. No one got hurt, but it could have been catastrophic. I asked the coworker later what he was thinking. He shrugged. I thought it would be funny. Sometimes people don't deserve jobs. They deserve parenting. Story 17. I used to work as a pharmacy tech. Most antibiotics for kids come as powder in a bottle. We add distilled water to make it liquid upon receiving prescriptions, as the solution only remains stable for 10 to 14 days, depending. One day, a father drops an amoxicillin prescription for a child. Usual questions are asked: age, weight, allergies, type of infection, desired flavor. Product is prepared and given to the father. He leaves. 2 hours later, he comes back, says the medication smells funny. I think, duh, medication often does. But I still waft the scent with my hand to my nose, and he's right. Something is off. I give the bottle to the pharmacist. He agrees and makes another bottle right away. The original antibacterial bottle smelled like straight-up alcohol. In a lab, we keep multiple solvents for many uses: water, simple syrup, mineral oil, and ethanol. One of the techs added ethanol to the antibiotic instead of water, and we were all shocked as to how the mistake could have occurred because all the solvents are one of different sizes, two of different label colors, and three identified in huge letters. We identified the tech guilty of that mistake, and they couldn't even say how that error occurred. Story 18. I worked for a nonprofit that hired this guy purely for his Rolodex, his connections to wealthy people, rather than any actual skills. His job was simple: bring rich people to our fundraising parties. They didn't care about anything else he did as long as he kept delivering on that. But when the pandemic hit and we all went remote, it became clear how incredibly incompetent he was with technology. He had been coasting by for years, avoiding emails and relying solely on phone calls. It wasn't a big deal in the office, but now that everything was online, we were in trouble. We had this big online fundraiser coming up, and I warned my boss that this guy had no clue how Zoom worked. He was constantly unmuted, had his camera aimed at his nostrils, and treated the whole thing like he was watching YouTube. But since he was the one bringing all the rich people to the event, they didn't want to lecture him about a computer program and hurt his ego. Well, during our huge 200-plus person Zoom event, he set his laptop down on the bathroom counter and proceeded to take a shirtless, disgusting old man dump. It was an absolute disaster. There was grunting, splashing, and squelching so loud it drowned out the speaker. It went on for a full 2 minutes before anyone realized what was happening. We couldn't mute him because he was the one in charge of inviting the donors, and the whole event had to end early. I nearly threw my laptop out the window that night. Story 19. I worked at a lumber mill that produced construction materials, and there was this guy who seemed to have a particular way of wanting the day off. For some reason, he'd throw things like wrenches, screws, and screwdrivers onto the conveyor belt that led straight to the giant wood chipper. Now, there was a magnetic sensor before the chipper that was supposed to detect any metal and stop the machines until it was cleared. But this guy would somehow bypass that sensor and throw tools past it, completely wrecking the machinery. And since it was a lumber mill, all the machines relied on the chipper to process the debris. Without it, everything came to a halt. So every time he did this, it meant a complete shutdown of the whole operation. The first time it happened, they thought it was just a mechanic who had accidentally left a tool behind, which is a fairly common mistake. But eventually the guy got caught. He threw a wrench and a screwdriver, and it caused such a big mess that we ended up shutting down for a whole week. And believe it or not, we all got paid for that week off, including the guy who caused it. He eventually got fired, but not before pulling off this stunt multiple times. It was almost like he was trying to get us all a paid vacation. Story 20. I worked at a place where the owner's son, in his mid-30s, was constantly getting assigned tasks, because they couldn't find a good fit for him. No matter what they gave him, he would somehow screw it up, but he still got paid a ton of money. One day, the owner asked him to take the lawnmower and mow the weeds growing around the outside of the warehouse. After a while, the warehouse manager noticed that there was no sound coming from outside, so he went to check. They found the owner's son not mowing the lawn, but instead sprinkling gasoline at the base of the warehouse walls. His genius idea was to skip the lawnmower altogether. Why waste time putting gas in the mower when he could just pour it directly on the weeds near the wooden walls and burn them all at once? Naturally, they had to stop him before he turned the whole place into a bonfire. And that wasn't the only time he managed to wreck things. We used to get products in cardboard boxes that were designed to become promotional displays. These boxes had trays for the product, and the engineers made them so they could be used in the store displays while minimizing waste and weight for better profits. We got a truckload of boxes once, and they had big warnings on them. Do not stack more than 2 high because of the weight of the product. But our hero, thinking he knew better, decided to stack them 4 high. The boxes seemed sturdy enough, but they started getting top-heavy. So to keep them from falling over, he decided to glue each box together for extra safety. Nobody realized until we went to ship the boxes to the stores, and of course the displays were completely ruined. It was a disaster. Story 21. I once worked under a manager who redefined what it meant to be a micromanager, but with the chaos of a tornado and the ego of a tyrant. She had this twisted habit of going into her direct reports documents, spreadsheets, slide decks, marketing copy, and fixing things. Except her fixes were always disastrous. She wouldn't tell you either. You'd open a file and find whole columns missing, formulas broken, sentences rewritten, or formatting mangled. I learned the hard way after a few public humiliations, so I got smart. I began saving a backup copy of every file I worked on, stored outside our shared folders. Just in case we were reviewing a highly detailed spreadsheet I had spent days compiling, it was for an internal audit. High stakes, lots of numbers, and absolutely no room for error. She shared the screen with everyone on the video call and started going off, criticizing the layout, questioning totals, deleting rows and columns as she spoke, clicking, dragging, slicing the data like it was a birthday cake. By the end of her tirade, the spreadsheet didn't even resemble what I had prepared. Then she dared to ask, "Why does none of this data make sense? Who approved this?" I took a deep breath and said, "Well, it made sense when the meeting started." I calmly pulled up the version history in front of the whole team. Click, her name over and over, every edit for the past 20 minutes. Click, restored the original file, perfectly intact. All the data matched. The silence was beautiful, a moment of collective vindication. Then I added, "So if we're done deleting everything, we can review the correct version now." That was the first and only time I saw her speechless. Team 1, Awful Boss 0. Story 22. I worked in a machine shop once, and one day a guy was using the overhead crane. It had 2 hooks. One was raised to the roof, and the other was lowered right next to another guy's machine. The guy operating the crane was focused on the hook near the roof, but the shop was incredibly loud, and he was wearing earmuffs, so he couldn't hear anything around him. As he mobilized the crane, he completely lost track of the other hook, which was dangerously close to the machines along the line. He started swinging the crane, and suddenly the hook was almost taking out everyone in its path. The first hook almost threw the guy into his lathe, and then it bounced off his toolboard and flipped over to the next machine. It almost put that guy into his lathe too, and then the same thing happened to the next few machines in the line. Each time it was a close call, but nobody could get his attention. It wasn't until the hook bounced off the last machine and grabbed the A-frame holding about 30-40 tons of steel bar stock that someone finally made it to him. They slapped the controls out of his hands, and that was the end of his day and his job. He never came back after that. Story 23. I worked at this tech repair shop where we handled everything from laptops and PCs to printers, but no TVs. The shop was run by 3 older guys, and one of them had his nephew working there too. The older guys were pretty chill, with one of them being incredibly laid back all the time. The nephew, though, was a complete moron. He had seniority over me, but for some reason they trusted me way more than they trusted him, even though he'd been there for years and was a close relative. One day, the chill guy had to take a printer to a company that was about 2 hours away. Before he left, he asked the nephew at least 10 times if he had properly tested the printer. The nephew assured him that he had just 5 minutes ago and that it was working fine. Well, he lied. The printer wasn't tested at all, and when the chill dude hooked it up at the company, it didn't work. The poor guy lost it. He went ballistic on the nephew, and it wasn't just this mistake. There had been many similar ones before. Needless to say, the nephew was fired shortly after that. All he had to do was test a freaking printer, which would have taken 5 minutes, but somehow he couldn't even manage that. Story 24. I worked in a care facility, and there was this patient who had late-stage Alzheimer's and had been progressively getting worse. He used to be a walker and wanderer, but over time, he just got sicker every day and eventually became completely bedbound. His condition was deteriorating, but they kept giving him his meds as usual. He ate less, and his stomach started becoming distended, but no one thought much of it. One day he was found unresponsive in his bed. It turned out he had vomited, and soon after he died. The nurse aides were tasked with cleaning him up, and one of them went to clean the strange vomit that had come out of his nose. She wiped it with her gloved hands, but to her shock it wasn't vomit, it was crap. He had a bowel obstruction so severe that everything had backed up, and he was vomiting his undigested food and fecal matter. A simple monitoring of his stomach could have caught this, and a simple check of his bowel movements would have shown that he hadn't had one in ages, but no one had bothered to track that. And apparently, the charting that should have been done hadn't been updated in months. The whole thing is deeply upsetting, and as someone who's experienced bowel obstructions as a child and knows how horrifying it is, I can't even imagine the pain he must have been in to the point where it came out of his nose. As a nurse, it makes me angry and horrified to see this level of negligence. There should have been consequences for those employees, but in some facilities, that's not always the case. I understand that many facilities underpay and overwork staff, but if you can let a patient deteriorate like this, you shouldn't be in this kind of profession at all. Story 25. I did landscaping and janitorial work alongside a 60-year-old Serbian man, let's call him Bozo. He was a refugee from the Civil War, hardly spoke any English, and was trying his best to provide for his family. The company owners took pity on him, but Bozo had a knack for doing some strange and at times frustrating things. One of the other groundskeepers put up a fake owl on top of one of the buildings. Bozo, being unfamiliar with the whole fake owl concept, thought it was real, and he was terrified of it. He genuinely believed it cursed the place, and no matter how many times I tried explaining it to him, he'd wince every time he saw it. Then one day I noticed shards of the owl all over the property, and the boss was yelling at Bozo for bringing a hunting rifle to work to shoot at it. Another time, we were using a ride scrubber to clean the factory floor. The scrubber worked by picking up dirt, but if you didn't clean it out regularly, it would just spread the dirt around, leaving nasty tracks. Naturally, Bozo never bothered to clean it out. While I was lawn mowing, he was running it non-stop, and by the time I got back, the factory floor was a disaster, a huge pile of sludge. One of the owners saw it on the security cameras, stormed over, and chewed him out. They warned him, if this isn't cleaned up by tomorrow, don't even think about coming in. The last story involves the owner's wife. She felt bad for Bozo and decided to do something charitable for him. She cleaned out the owner's closet and donated some of his old blazers and suits so that Bozo could look good for church or any events. But instead of wearing them for special occasions, Bozo started wearing these suits while working. Remember, he was a janitor and landscaper. One day I walked in and saw Bozo on a riding mower, wearing a tweed blazer. I couldn't help but laugh when the owner came up to me and said, "I think that's my old blazer. As far as I know, Bozo is still working there." Story 26. I managed a construction security team for a beachfront project that required 24-hour on-site patrols. I ran the daytime team, and my friend handled the graveyard shift. Since it was a dredging operation, we had 2 guys posted near the shore to make sure civilians didn't wander into the work area. We had a square on the beach, with a guard at each corner. One night, we couldn't find one of our night guards, and his phone kept sending calls straight to voicemail. After some digging, we found out that he had set up a folding chair on the sand at around 2 a.m. and fell asleep at his post. Unfortunately, the high tide came in about an hour later, and it completely wrecked him. His phone and everything in his pockets were destroyed. He ended up going home soaking wet without telling anyone. I don't think he got reprimanded for it, though. I'm pretty sure the shame was punishment enough. He eventually got fired for another mishap, driving a company ATV off a sandbank and getting it stuck. It was a pretty ridiculous series of events, but at least we learned the importance of staying alert on the job. Story 27. Back in the late 70s, I worked as a tree surgeon. Each morning we'd gather in the garage, and the boss would hand out a 3x5 card with the day's address and instructions. One of the guys, known by the nickname Ding, was a bit prone to mistakes, and one day he misread the address on the card. Instead of going to the right place, Ding led the crew to the wrong address. The instructions on the card were pretty clear: cut down all trees and shrubs in preparation for demolition work. The boss also mentioned that the house was being torn down for new construction, so the crew's job was to clear out the whole lot. But because Ding got the address wrong, things went sideways. The foreman didn't check the address or double-check anything. He just went with it thinking it was all good and started cutting down the big trees and throwing them straight into the chipper. By mid-afternoon, the entire lot was cleared, trees, shrubs, everything gone. They finished the job and headed back to the shop. When they got back, the boss was livid. He stormed up and asked, "Where the hell were you guys? I went out to the job and you weren't there." Then the foreman casually told him, "Well, we finished the job, trees are all gone, whole lot's cleared." The crew had gotten so caught up in it that they didn't even realize they'd removed everything, including some massive 2-foot-thick trees and all the mature azaleas and rhododendrons. Can you imagine coming home and finding that your entire yard had been stripped of its trees and plants? I'm guessing insurance probably ended up covering it somehow, but it was a mess. I didn't stick around much longer after that. Story 28. One time, I had to deal with a temp who was an absolute nightmare. He was caught browsing corn multiple times on the company computers instead of doing his job, and his excuses were both ridiculous and infuriating. Each time we caught him, we'd say, "You were browsing corn again. We've told you many times that's against company policy," to which he'd respond, "No, I didn't." When we pointed out that we were looking at him on the screen browsing corn, he denied it, claiming, "That's not me." We showed him the evidence, like the explicit sites on his taskbar, and he'd insist that was always there. When we'd bring up the pop-up windows from corn sites, he'd claim that was someone else who was here earlier. We'd ask him, "Who?" and he'd randomly make up a person, "You know, that hairy guy with the beard." When we explained that there was no such person, he would just keep up the absurd story saying, "I know, I saw him. He browses the corn all the time." It was like trying to reason with a mentally deficient child. It became clear that he had no impulse control, and the entire situation was just a mix of lies and absurdity. Eventually, we were all just relieved when his contract ended, and we no longer had to deal with his nonsense. Story 29. I worked in a grocery store for 12 years, and one day I received an in-house page to come to the receiving dock to assist the grocery manager. We had just gotten a load of groceries in, and the driver hadn't used a load lock, a bar that's meant to keep the product secure in the truck if it's not full. As a result, we had 9 full pallets of product toppled over and broken. My job was to take pictures of the mess on my cell phone, while the grocery manager called up our distribution center to report the incident. The driver was immediately fired, and we had to take his keys away. He had to find his way home, which was a 4-hour drive. Throughout the ordeal, he kept complaining, insisting that it wasn't his fault, and that they couldn't force him to provide his load lock since he was an independent contracted driver. In the end, he caused about $10,000 worth of damage, lost his job, and ruined his future chances of driving a big rig in the state, just because he couldn't be bothered to buy a $50 piece of equipment, or even ask our warehouse for one, which they would have happily loaned him. This reminded me of a new warehouse manager at my old job in a large liquor store. The store was huge, like the size of a grocery store, with a second-floor warehouse. This guy had never worked in a warehouse or any kind of labor job, but they decided he was a better fit than promoting from within. One of our high-volume products was the 4L jugs of Carlo Rossi. Although it's cheap, it's pretty terrible, so we kept all varieties stacked by the pallet. These pallets were always a bit sketchy, with cases hanging off the edges, held together by flimsy pallet wrap and one strip of packing tape per layer. To handle them, you had to cut off just the top layer, which everyone knew. But this new manager decided to open the entire pallet. As the pallet became increasingly unsteady, he seemed unfazed. I first learned of the issue when a panicked supervisor pointed me toward the first floor, where wine was leaking through the ceiling. If you've ever had to clean up wet cardboard full of broken glass, you know it's a nightmare. He was still the warehouse manager when I quit. Story 30. Many years ago, a coworker was drilling 1 2-inch holes in a bar above his head with one of those old big metal hand drills that you have to push the button to keep running. I warned him that it wasn't safe, but he continued. Eventually, the drill bit jammed, and the drill whipped out of his hands. As the drill fell, he caught the cord, but the drill continued its descent and arched straight toward his private parts. The bit grabbed onto his pants and started twisting. He somehow managed to catch the drill, all while screaming that the big drill was tearing up his pants. I ran over and quickly pulled the plug. By the time I got to him, he was lying on the ground, still screaming in pain. His pants were so tangled around the drill bit that we had to cut them off. He didn't lose anything too serious, but there were some deep cuts, and a couple were bad enough to warrant an emergency trip to the hospital. The guy never came back to work after that. Story 31. My friend Katie had this incredible knack for messing up everything. She couldn't even count change without giving a 50 instead of a 5. She'd break a few every time she washed dishes. She somehow managed to order 200 gallons of milk when we only needed 4. She flooded the kitchen 4 times and set it on fire twice. She couldn't be trusted to close, not just alone, but at all. Even the little things became disasters. If you were stacking up dishes, she'd wait until you were finally done, all proud of yourself, to casually dump a whole new pile of dishes on top. She'd spend so much time wiping down clean tables that the dirty ones would be completely ignored. If you ever bummed her a cigarette, she'd take it as a free pass to steal as many as she wanted and rummage through your stuff, leaving it all messy in the process. And when you'd try to grab a cigarette, after she'd nearly poisoned someone by mixing up detergent and caramel for the 7th time that day, you'd realize she'd taken them all. I don't think she was lazy or trying to get out of work. She just had this amazing ability to screw things up in every possible way, and then she'd act like she had no idea what happened. I don't know how she did it, but she managed to make the same mistake over and over, with zero awareness. She was honestly one of the most hopeless people I've ever met. They tried to fire her a few times, but every time they did, her mom would show up and yell at the manager, and instead of sticking to it, the manager would back down and say, "Well, just keep a closer eye on her." And we did. We'd follow her around, monitoring every move. But the second you took your eye off her, she'd do something ridiculous, like throwing the fresh cookies from the fresh cookies tray into the trash, because in her mind they were for stale cookies, despite there being no such thing. Despite all the chaos she caused, Katie was pretty nice. I hope wherever she ended up, she didn't burn it down. Story 32. A few years ago, while working in it at a hospital, I got a call about a computer that wasn't turning on. This wasn't an unusual request. 95% of these calls were just user errors, so I was prepared for the typical mix-up. But this time it was way beyond the usual. When I arrived at the office, the computer was indeed dead, as reported. I started by checking the plug, which was properly affixed to the wall and seemed to be in good shape. I asked the user what had happened when the computer stopped working. She casually explained, "Well, I thought it was too hot, so I used the water cooling option." Now, the computer in question had a fan port on top, which looked a bit like a funnel, and that's what she pointed to when she mentioned water cooled. I was immediately confused, so I told her there aren't even any water-cooled PCs here. Someone working in a hospital, saving lives, didn't quite understand that water plus computer is a recipe for disaster. Story 33. I once watched a guy almost get crushed while working at Home Depot. They were setting up some 20 feet tall orange racking for a display, the kind with side supports that weigh over 100 pounds each. In my opinion, this should have been a 4-person job, but it was a common practice to do it with only 2 people. To set it up, they needed to get one side standing up, which wasn't bolted to the ground, just balancing on its tiny footprint, and then they were supposed to place the crossbeams in the middle to connect it. So one guy had the side standing and his coworker was about to pick up the other side's support. As the second guy was placing the crossbeam, he turned his back and started walking away, which threw off the balance of the whole frame. As you can probably guess, the frame started to fall toward him. Fortunately, the other guy noticed it in time and was somehow strong enough to catch it. Later, I watched the store manager get chewed out by the district manager for trying to make me do a similar reckless setup with racking. Story 34. I worked at a small aircraft maintenance and supply place, and one day they had this brilliant idea. They ordered new tool sets for the new hangar they had opened down the road. They decided to send the resident moron to pick them up. It seemed like a win-win. He was visiting family in the same city as the tool supplier over the holiday weekend, so the company bought him a ticket to go down on Wednesday. Then the plan was for him to rent a box truck, pick up the tools, and bring them back the following Monday after his vacation. From what I understood, it wasn't exactly cheaper or faster, but that was the plan. So he rents the truck, picks up the tools, and on the way back, parks the unlocked truck somewhere in the city. And then he just doesn't bother calling anyone. No police, no company, not even his supervisor, Tyrone. He doesn't make a single call to inform anyone. The truck was just left there, unsecured, and when he returned on Monday, it was empty. The tools were gone. The cost to the company was over $150K. Story 35. This wasn't just traditional incompetence. This was next-level ridiculousness. This guy, Randall, was hired around the same time I was, and we went through the same training class together. Right off the bat, he bragged about all his super high-tier hacking skills. He was 18 at the time and hired for a sales and billing position at a call center. But honestly, Randall wasn't exactly a hit with his coworkers. His desk was covered in MLP toys, and he'd constantly yammer on about his plans for fan dubs of various TV shows. It was clear he wasn't getting much work done, and it didn't help that he spent more time talking about his special interests than focusing on his job. Needless to say, his sales were terrible. He couldn't connect with customers at all. I overheard him trying to explain the plot of My Little Pony to a man in his late 60s who just wanted to pay his bill. The customer was uninterested, but Randall didn't get the hint. Since Randall's sales were so bad, and he was still stuck on being an elite hacker, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He went to a different department's computers, logged in with his credentials, and started ordering products for customers who hadn't asked for them. If that doesn't sound like fraud, I don't know what does. To make matters worse, these computers track logins, so of course, Randall's actions were easily traced. Not only did he use his credentials, but he also used his credit card. He liked to give his card to coworkers to order food, so when the auditors checked the accounts, they saw both his credentials and his credit card numbers linked to these unauthorized orders. It didn't take long for the auditors to figure out what had happened, and it was no surprise when he was let go. He thought he could get away with fraud while using his own credit card and login information. Story 36. I work in a camera store, and this coworker worked in our lab, where we print pictures and process film. We have a machine that automatically develops film, which is super convenient. All we need to do is load the film and change the chemicals every so often. Now, for those who might not know, film is light sensitive. If it's exposed to light before it goes through the chemicals, the film is ruined, and there won't be any pictures to print. So you can see why messing with it outside of the process is a huge problem. One day, my coworker was working on his computer when the film machine started beeping. Instead of checking the machine's screen or waiting to see what the problem was, he walked over to it and opened it up while the film was running through it. This was such a big no-no, especially because he was exposing customer film that had already been dropped off and paid for. Our head lab guy started yelling at him to close the machine immediately, shouting, "You're exposing the film." I was just standing there, a sales worker, totally in shock. The machine has a screen that tells you exactly what the issue is, and more importantly, it tells you when the film is being processed. So there was no reason for him to open it up. I have no idea why he did it. He wasn't fired over this incident, but my manager was planning to write him up for a few other things, and they were already looking to replace him. He barely lasted a month before he ended up quitting just 2 days ago. Story 37. I used to work at Whataburger, a fast food chain in Texas, and while there were small incidents here and there, one particular moment made me want to quit. I was tasked with running food out to customers in the drive-thru, and at one point, the three guys working the deep fryer decided it would be a good idea to use almost all of the fry baskets to fry chicken for other orders that weren't even being made yet. Meanwhile, the orders sitting on the preparation table were waiting on onion rings, which would have gone into those same deep fryers if the guys hadn't occupied the baskets with chicken. To make matters worse, we couldn't use the fry baskets anyway because management had already chewed us out for doing that earlier. So there we were, backed up on food orders, with the fryer useless. And while these guys stood around like the Three Stooges, there were angry and hungry customers in the drive-thru getting fed up because they were getting their food. Unfortunately, our drive-thru was designed poorly, one lane that split into two, and both were completely occupied, plus the parking lot was full. The idiots started blaming me for not putting fries in the bags that didn't need them, all while I was trying to calm down customers and assure them their food wouldn't be cold when it came out. I couldn't even respond because I was too busy trying to handle the crowd. It was a solid hour of yelling and frustration before everyone got their food, and things finally started running smoothly again. After all that chaos, the one manager who was there pulled me aside and said, "I saw you on the cameras, and while everyone else was working, you were just standing there chatting with customers. Like, excuse me, I was trying to keep the customers from losing it on us. Maybe don't have three guys on a two-man station. Maybe come out of the office and actually help improve the customer experience instead of just hiding." He said he was going to write me up for it, but when I came in next time, the general manager told me that the write-up had been thrown out because he knew I wasn't just standing around during the rush. Meanwhile, the three guys who caused all the chaos never faced any consequences, but the rest of the staff started treating them differently after that day. It might not sound too severe when you put it in words, but when you're juggling angry customers, dealing with a broken system, and having people blame you for things out of your control, it's incredibly frustrating. On top of that, the manager chose to lecture me instead of helping, even though he saw everything that had happened. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.